Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for our chapter book story time. We're here at the Caribou Public Library. I'm Miss Erin and I'm so glad that you are here with us today. So I've decided to do a little intermission in the middle of our reading of Little Women. And so today we are going to actually read a book called Flat Stanley. If you've never heard of this book, it was very popular and actually it's still writing newer versions and parts of a series about Flat Stanley still. This book was written by Jeff Brown. But the reason I decided to choose Flat Stanley as our intermission type book is because we have a Flat Stanley here at the Caribou Public Library. One of our generous patrons and creative patrons had volunteered to make Stanley. He is flat. She even made a t-shirt that says Caribou Public Library printed on the front for him. And the idea behind having Flat Stanley here at the library is that you, as a patron, can come and check him out. You can bring him home and take him around, give him some adventures, show him the things that you do in your life, maybe take him on vacation if you go somewhere else, but also show what Caribou and Aroostook County in Maine has to offer that's really fun or interesting or just something that you love. Then we have a binder here at the library that we will keep photographs that you take of you and Flat Stanley doing things together, and hopefully with a little bit of a description of what it is that's in the photograph, what you're doing with him. We'll put those in the page protectors of the binder so that the public, other kids and families, can read what Flat Stanley has done and get ideas for things that maybe they might do with him. All right, so we have him available as of today. He's ready to check out. If any of you are interested in doing that, please come in or call the library if you have any questions. I will have a schedule or a calendar that will be available if you know that you're going to be doing something interesting that you want to take him with you to sign up for that particular time or day so that you have him available, like a reservation that you might reserve a book. Do the same thing with Stanley so that he's available when you need him for that particular event or trip. Okay? All right, so Stanley is going to be listening as we read today. I'll get him set up here, maybe a little bit behind me. There he is. Actually, we're going to do it like this. He'll sit on my lap. All right, so Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown. Or maybe we won't have him sit on my lap. No, I don't know the best way to do this. All right, the pictures are by Tommy Unger, and I will show you the pictures as we go along here. All right, so breakfast was ready. "I will go wake up the boys," Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband, George Lambchop. Just then their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom that he shared with his brother Stanley. "Hey, come and look! Hey!" Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were both very much in favor of politeness and careful speech. "Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people," Mr. Lambchop said as they entered the bedroom. Try to remember that. "Excuse me," Arthur said, "but look." He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay the enormous bulletin board that Mr. Lambchop had given the boys a Christmas ago so they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would still have been sleeping if he'd not been woken by his brother's shouts. "What's going on here?" he called out cheerfully from beneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed. "Heavens," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Gosh," said Arthur, "Stanley's flat." "As a pancake," said Mr. Lambchop. "Darndest thing I've ever seen." "Let's all have breakfast," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Then Stanley and I will go see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say." What do you think of that? It just flattened him. The examination was almost over. "How do you feel?" Dr. Dan asked. "Does it hurt very much?" "I felt sort of tickly for a while after I got up," Stanley Lambchop said. "But I feel fine now." "Well, that's how it is with most of these cases." Or that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. "We'll just have to keep an eye on this young fellow," he said when he had finished the examination. "Sometimes we doctors, despite all our years of training and expertise, can only marvel at how little we really know." Mrs. Lambchop said she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered by the tailor now, so Dr. Dan told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements. Mrs. Lambchop wrote them down. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. Half an inch thick. Look at that. There she is, taking the measurements in the doctor's office. Pretty flat, huh? When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms, even when the door was closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a dark, deep shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied the end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down from one side to the other so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. Here he is, sliding under a door. And here he is, going through the grating to find the ring. Do you think he finds it? 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I'm not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the policeman. "We have caught a cuckoo." Crazy, right? Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" He must have found it. Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame." The policeman apologized. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We've been hasty. We see that now." "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realized that that was a good rule, and they said they would try to remember it. Here are the policemen. And then we have, Stanley coming up through the grating, holding the ring. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh, boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mr. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive," he said. "I will have to think of some cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich, which was made with thin bread, and a flat cigarette case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or airplane ticket to California would have been. Here is Stanley fitting into his envelope. So I'll show you what we have for Stanley here. We have a big bag, kind of like that envelope. I don't think it's so big it doesn't even fit in the screen. Anyway, it's perfect for fitting Stanley in and protecting him when you bring him around Caribou. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope along with the egg salad sandwich and the cigarette case full of milk, and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope that they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it "valuable" and "fragile" and "this end up" on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the post office department, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys off with him on Sunday afternoons, to a museum or roller skating in the park. But it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon, in the street, they met an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's, a man he'd not seen for years. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son, Stanley." Here, take a look at what it looks like. With Stanley all rolled up next to him. He's holding onto the loop with his hand. So his friend thought that Stanley was wallpaper. He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. He said to Mr. Lambchop, "George, that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard when they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that evening, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help but being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." So here's Stanley rolled up again. And then here is Arthur's feet, right, sticking out from underneath all the Encyclopedia Britannicas. Stanley and Arthur were in the park. The day was sunny but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails, made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite and will win a kite-flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, up, up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully a little at a time so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight, in his green sweater and brown trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. I can imagine. Look, here they are, tying him up to the string, and then flying high in the air. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice while he was eating the hot dog that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." Now, that's as far as we're going to go today, but we'll read the second half of Flat Stanley next time. So I hope you're able to join us then. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you later. Bye for now.